Well, thanks so much. I've rarely seen this room this full and with this much energy, and it's really great to be with you all. And I know that I'll be spending the afternoon this week with a number of you for my class on vocation and career. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, where I lead a group that we call Vocation, Career, and Work Team, looking at ways that government policy can assist all Americans, and especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, gain the education, training, and supportive services they need to succeed in the workforce. So, very important, this is being streamed out into the world this afternoon. And you, because of that, you perform a critical function. You have to be the laugh track for this event, so that people who are just watching online know that we're not alone as we're doing this. For those of you who don't online, obviously this will not be new information for people in the room, but for those online who are unfamiliar with AEI, we're a nonprofit public policy research institute dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. The work of our scholars and staff advances ideas rooted in our belief in democracy, free enterprise, American strength and global leadership, solidarity with those at the periphery of our society, and a pluralistic and entrepreneurial culture. We do this through a network of scholars here at AEI, some living in other places around the country. Our institutional ethos is of scholarly integrity and independence, and I'm going to return to that in a moment. No one inside or outside this institute ever tells a scholar what to research or what kinds of conclusions to reach. And that's also true, I might say, of Brookings, who's represented here today by Tony Pipa. So this is this session is part, or one in a series of meetings that we've been doing, Tony and I have been doing, looking at the differences between rural and urban America, and particularly about the challenges of rural America as they have been shaped by demography and economics and technical and social factors. This is called On the Front Porch, and our intention was to gather for the kinds of conversations that we hope would be happening in America more broadly, on the front porches of America, with people exchanging their concerns, their views, their thoughts about how to make how to build better communities and how to build a stronger country. We're looking at questions of how federal policy might be used to promote development and opportunity outside the nation's major metropolitan areas. So far, we've looked at a number of different questions relating to the challenges facing rural America. We've looked at voting patterns, social attitudes, economic disparities. But today, we are zooming in on one of the most difficult problems facing rural communities, the ongoing crisis of substance abuse and the particular place of opioids in that crisis. I referenced earlier scholarly independence, and I want to dwell on that for just a second because it's particularly important on this issue. As I said, our scholars we do our research without anybody telling us what to do. We don't even know who's funding our research because they won't tell us. That's to make sure that we are giving 100% our own view of the challenges that are facing, that we're trying to address through our research. There was a controversy a number of years ago about the fact that AEI had taken funds from a pharma company that later got caught up in the opioid crisis. Their role in it became public, and the Institute had taken money from them. We have not taken money from any pharmaceutical, or from that pharmaceutical company since 2016. But it's important, just for transparency's sake, that you know that we, as I said, complete scholarly independence and complete separation of fundraising from the policy conclusions that our scholars develop, including on this issue. So, having gotten that out of the way, I want to introduce our panel. This is an incredibly distinguished group of people. My AEI colleague, Dr. Sally Satel, is a practicing psychiatrist and lecturer at Yale University School of Medicine. She examines mental health policy as well as political trends in medicine. In addition to her work at AEI, Dr. Satel works in a Washington, D.C. methadone clinic, helping to provide treatment. She also spent a year recently in southeastern Ohio, providing substance abuse treatment services. Our other contributor here today is Keith Humphreys, Dr. Keith Humphreys. He's the Esther Ting Memorial Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. He's also a senior research career scientist at the VA Health Services Research Center in Palo Alto and an honorary professor of psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College in London. For his work in the UK, Queen Elizabeth made him an honorary officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2022. Does that make you Lord Humphreys, Sir Humphrey? What? It's actually, yeah, anyway, I'm teasing him, but it's a recognition of just how the great contributions that Keith makes both here and abroad. And finally, Tony Pipa is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. Tony launched and leads the Reimagining Federal Rural Policy Initiative, which seeks to modernize and transform U.S. federal policy to enable community and economic development in underserved rural places across the U.S. He is also the host of an amazing podcast called Reimagine Rural. It's so well done. It's like you're listening to NPR on their best day podcast. It's really just a great podcast which profiles rural towns across America that are making progress on their efforts to thrive amid social and economic change. So if you're a podcast person like I am, make sure to add that to your rota. Okay, so we're going to start out. I want both Keith and Sally. We're going to let Keith go first since he's the non-AEI honored guest here. Just take a few minutes to talk about your background in addiction research, and what does this audience here need to know, and what does the audience online need to know from your perspective about this crisis?
Okay, thank you for having me, and thank you, Tony, too, for this panel, and to all of you for being here. So I grew up in West Virginia, the epicenter of this crisis, and I went to school in the Midwest, and I thought I wanted to do something in mental health, and I was working at a Wendy's for $3.35 an hour, and a friend of mine came in and said she was leaving the psychiatry department, and there was a research job there, and I said, really, what does it pay? She says, $4.40 an hour. And she said, it's about addiction. I said, wow, always been interested in that, which was a lie. I did $4.40 an hour, though. Incentives work. So I am the only person you will ever meet who got into the addiction field for the money. But why I stayed in it is that addiction is an incredibly compelling thing to spend your time on, both in a human way and in sort of a intellectual way. The human part being if you talk to addicted people, you work with them, work with their families, you see everything that is powerful about the human experience. You see love, struggles with control, redemption, guilt, pain, death, all of that. So it pulled on my heart. And then as just an intellectual problem, it's fascinating. Why do people do this? Why do people who have a lot going for them destroy it all for the sake of non-nutritive powders in pills. That is a fascinating mystery to try to solve. Actually, I can't remember the beginning of your question. I'm sorry, Brett. And it was
you have. I want you to just like pretend you are the czar of addiction knowledge and practice in the United States. What are the 2 or 3 things that people need to know about this based on what you've learned over the years?
So a couple important things to know. One is that people don't expect to end up where they end up. And if you look at somebody who's living in a tent and using meth all day, that isn't what they expected their life to be. And we're very bad at predicting our own risk, our own susceptibility to addiction from drugs. So if let's say we knew the number, what proportion of people who use meth get addicted to it, and let's say it was 1 in 4, just for the sake of argument, in any group of 4 people, all 4 would say, well, I wouldn't be in that group. But somebody clearly is in that group, and we're bad at it. And that is why a key reason why we try to restrict supply, because we are just really bad at guessing how drugs will affect us and the things we'll do to keep trying to get them once we're addicted. The second thing worth knowing is that unlike other health conditions, there's a lot of reward in addiction. So people are ambivalent about giving up drugs. You might think, how could you be ambivalent if your life is a complete mess? It's like, well, because it feels really good. So that makes it different than chronic pain or depression or conditions where people will do anything to get rid of this condition. People often, I'm not sure I want to stop using these drugs. And so as a practical matter, a large number of people, in fact, I would say the overwhelming majority of people who come in and seek help are under pressure. And that can be, as a friend of mine used to say, they have a back problem. My boss was on my back, my wife was on my back, and my family was on my back. People pushing you, or sometimes the law pushing you. And in the absence of that, it is actually a rare person who just comes in spontaneously and says, I think I'm not doing well in my life, and I'd really like to, reevaluate my substance use. That you pray for that as a clinician, but it's very often not what you see. And so we have to think about that, and we think about what are we going to do about trying to get people to change their behavior in a way you don't have to worry about that with diseases that are just complete misery. I'll stop there as a start. Yeah.
Okay, Sally, let's hear your story and what are the 2 or 3 most important things that people need to understand about this crisis?
I'll make my story short because we're on the front porch.
No, that's a place for long stories.
Yeah, but not when you're with this many people. So, in a way like you, Keith, I never wanted to really go into addiction. Well, maybe you said you did because you found it interesting after someone bribed you with money to go into it. But I really wanted to study schizophrenia when I was even when I was in medical school. I'm one of the rare people who went to medical school knowing that I wanted to be a psychiatrist. Most people figure out what they want to be once they get there. But and I knew I wanted to work with people who had severe mental illness, who were psychotic, delusional, hallucinating. And but when I finished my residency and was ready for my real job, I was told by the chairman, because I wanted to stay at my institution, he said, well, that's very nice, but we don't need anyone in the schizophrenia unit. We need someone in the addiction unit at the West Haven VA. And I wasn't that excited until, excuse me, I realized that crack cocaine, probably the only one who benefited from crack cocaine, was starting to really rage in Bridgeport and New Haven, and it was assumed, and it turned out not to be the case, but that cocaine and crack especially would create the same sort of psychotic profile that you would see with heavy methamphetamine use from the 50s, the speed freaks, and that's a whole other era from you guys. But and I thought, well, I'll get into researching psychosis through the back door. It'll be drug-induced, but it'll still be psychosis. So that actually ended up being my first research, oh my gosh, was on the psychosis producing effects of crack. Turned out it was much tamer than methamphetamine. People might become paranoid And then they'd usually sleep it off and they'd get over it. But anyway, that's how I ended up in this. And I always say just kind of what you said, Keith, in terms of what makes this field so fascinating is the spread. I mean, it goes from neurons to Shakespeare. I mean, it's just huge. And you can do policy, you can do brain research, you can, frankly, analyze addiction memoirs. There's a lot to be done. Of course, you can treat people, which is what I do in the methadone clinic. So, okay, so my things here, one overlaps with Keith. First is that people use drugs for reasons, okay? I mean, yes, they feel good, but they don't just feel good. Because if they felt good, then you'd feel good and then go back to your life. So why aren't people going back to their life? And it's because their lives are often miserable. So, and drugs really, really help with misery. People talk about stimulants and depressants, but I also talk about oblivions. They really make you numb to what's going on in your life. And you can titrate drugs in lots of ways. You can titrate them to the point of oblivion. And I don't mean nodding out. I mean being able to go through the rest of your day. Or some people just titrate them to the point where they're actually helps them with their work. We don't hear about that very much, but there are a lot of varieties of addictive experience. Others, and I'll be quick, the cliche, you didn't adhere to it, but I'm just saying, is no one wants to be an addict. Yeah, no one wants to be an addict, but they want what addiction provides in terms of, again, I was referring to that relief. So they're not looking to be addicted, they're looking to find relief. And that comes on incrementally, just like obesity and any other bad situation. It's gradually and then suddenly. Two more. Another, and Keith, this is so important, so I'm going to say it again. Coercion works. You think, well, if a judge sentences someone to drug treatment, well, that's not going to work because he doesn't want it. It works, and the reason is because over time, people usually internalize the values of the treatment program, and they see themselves starting to feel a little better. They see there are people to help them. And my final thing is that, we're hear a lot about how drug companies have caused this epidemic. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But you'll never get an epidemic of any kind, forget drugs, food, whatever. You can't just look at supply. You have to look at demand, because supply without demand is nothing. It's certainly not an epidemic.
Okay, so this isn't supposed to be just the Brent talks to Keith and Sally show. This is intended to be a bipartisan exploration. From your direction, I'm sitting at the right. That guy down there is at the left. Okay. So Tony, I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask some questions here too.
Yeah. So thanks very much for both of you framing what you think the key takeaways that we need to understand about addiction are. One of the ways in which we talk about addiction is as a disease. So that's not just about behavior, but that's about something physical. So how do we understand that? Like, what's the connection between those two things? And then what I would love to do then is then start to think about, okay, because we're here about like rural communities. How does this link up to rural? But before we get there, what's the basis for disease, which to me connotes something like physically happening that you might not be in conscious control of, for example?
Yeah, I mean, when you have this discussion, you get immediately what do you think a disease is? So Alcoholics Anonymous had a disease model, but they weren't referring to something biomedical. They meant this is not just a lot of drinking. This is something about our nature. We are alcoholics, we don't have alcoholism. That's the way they used it. The way it's used in medicine tends to be referring to a set of neurological realities of people. You see adaptations in particular regions of the brain, and you have stronger urges to use, and that view is what most doctors would say. Well, that's really a disease. I think what people though are really arguing about though is something else entirely. Not that they're arguing about blame and control. So that,
I'm sorry, say it again.
I think what people are really arguing about when they argue about disease, it's about blame and control. So they'll say it's a disease, and what they're really saying is, I don't want anyone to be blamed, and these folks don't have any control or not. And where people say it isn't a disease, they're maintaining, no, there is blame because there is some control. And that's really sort of the moral discussion that goes around with it. I mean, and the reality is, first off, we all make the choice to use drugs, at least initially, entirely, right? So there clearly is, everyone has at least some control of decisions they make. It is clear when people when people are addicted, it is harder. Self-control does become harder, but rarely does it become completely impossible. So you're something between, absolutely automatized and as free as someone who's not addicted is. And because of that, this debate will probably go on forever, because people can, here's this example, I had a friend who was studying rabbis who were like 3-pack-a-day smokers in Israel, but they never smoked on holy days. It's like, well, how do you do that? It's just like, well, it's just very important. I wouldn't smoke on holy days. You see a lot of behaviors like that in people who are severely addicted. They will not use in certain places, certain times, in certain places, which tells you there is usually, except in very extreme cases, some control, but it's harder. So there's a space to be sympathetic. It's like, I'm lifting a 10-pound weight, but maybe, you're lifting a 100-pound weight. But you can do that, but it's a lot harder than what I'm doing. For you not to use could be a lot harder than for me not to use.
So I know that this is a key kind of debate within the world of treatment, and I know that I've heard Sally talk about this too. Like, you're not such a big fan of the disease model. So can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Yeah, but I'm less of a fan of what's called the brain disease model, which is really how it's thought of in medicine often. And I should say, I agree with everything he said. And and I've really always had problems with the brain disease model, and that when that's discussed, it's usually accompanied by a brain scan showing the brain on fire. And you know what? It's all true. That brain scanning, PET scanning and functional magnetic resonance fMRIs, brilliant technology. They're certainly capturing real activity in the brain, but the implication of that kind of presentation is that the person is utterly helpless. And sometimes people feel helpless, but but we know that an addicted brain is not an autonomous brain. How do we know that? It's because it responds to consequences. I mean, every single person who's walked into a methadone clinic said, I'm there because, my wife is going to leave me, or my boss is going to fire me, or my probation officer is going to violate me, or something. It's a consequence, and they are responding to it. Their brains are addicted, but they are responding to it because they still have some remnant of decision-making capacity and will. So, what I always say is, you can think of addiction operating on a lot of different explanatory levels. Of course, you can talk about it unfolding at the level of the brain, and if you're a neuroscientist, that's fascinating. Hasn't really translated into any therapies yet, but it may one day, and besides, it's fascinating, and that's enough. And it would have, I think it has implications for other kinds of problems, like depression and attention problems and impulsivity, this kind of thing. But, so that's one explanatory level, what happens at the brain. Then there's a level of what happens behaviorally. People are very cue responsive. That's almost like a Pavlovian phenomenon. Then there's a psychological dimension, and that's, if you ever read an addiction memoir, that's what they're all about, the psychology of use, why people use. And I mentioned people use for reasons. Then you can look at the behavioral, then you can look at the, the environmental or cultural levels, and they all, they all contribute in different individuals. One or two of those levels may contribute more. They may differ in their weight over the course of a person's addiction. But so the way I look at it is just what's the most productive way to think about addiction. And from what I can tell, it's typically, from a policy standpoint and from a clinician standpoint, it's mainly at the level of psychology, behavior, and environment. And the level of the brain is the least helpful when you want to think about what are we going to do about this. Technically, addiction is a behavior, and but to me, I consider it more a symptom than a disease because, as I've been saying, it's a response to some sort of distress, and that distress can come from within the person, or that distress can come from living in an environment that someone just feels is just they don't see any hope.
And so, could both of you just give us your perspective on, so how did this particular crisis of opioids, which, you know, you let me know, or they seem to be highly addictive, right? They've got really highly addictive. I'm a former athlete. I've taken them for pain, and I'm very careful because of propensity that I even felt, you know, from myself. How did this come to be rooted primarily, at least at the beginning, and really ravaging still, in rural places? What's the story from your perspective on that?
I'm curious what Sally would say, but first off, you say you're right. It started in rural areas, although now it's pretty much everywhere. Right. But why that? So there's a couple things. One is, what is it like to be a country doctor, okay, relative to other types of doctors, like a doctor at Stanford? So if someone came in with an injury, you could say, well, let's try physical therapy. Let's try psychotherapy. Let's try, other types of, let's do physical rehab. You have none of those things, usually if you're a doctor out in the rural area. So what can you do for people who come in and they're suffering? You can write a script. So that is part of it. And we know that was a part throughout the US, also up in Canada, that there were doctors, that's what they did, because that was, not because they were mean, but that's all they had the power to do. Second thing is just, a spectacular increase in supply. And we know that was consequential because a really terrific paper by Dr. Abby Alpert showed that at the beginning, Purdue Pharma, there were a couple states that had something called a triplicate prescription requirement, where the doctor gets one, the patient gets one, and the state gets one. And Purdue Pharma judged, we're not going to be able to market in those states. It's too much of a hassle to get around that system, so they didn't. Even 10 years later, those places had dramatically lower rates of death. So the marketing and the supplies that went with it, are absolutely part of this story. And if you read the book, which is a really good book, Death in Mud Lick, by the guy Eric Eyre, who's won a Pulitzer. He's from my home state, West Virginia. But he was documenting these little towns, 300, 500 people, getting shipments of millions of pills over the course of it. That is going to have consequences when it's that available and and that completely unregulated. So that is clearly part of the story. Same time, I want to say it is not the case that it was just people in black hats beating the people in the white hats, like a simple morality tale. There was massive failures of regulation. So, for example, the OxyContin came with a label that said this is believed to be less addictive. That was a lie. There was no evidence for that, but that was approved by the FDA. And the guy who approved it, 12 months afterwards, was working for Purdue Pharma at a much higher salary. So the people who should have been, the good guys, the good gals protecting us often fell down on the job. And that made it easier for the companies to do this. And then go back to rural areas. Often those constraints are lower in rural areas. The people who would have done that, monitored it, kept what was, advocating. I mean, Eric is a miracle. He's in West Virginia, but there's barely a state paper left in the whole state to keep track of these things. And that's just the resource to describe what's going on, watch what's going on, is just less in rural areas than in a big city like Washington, say.
Well, there's no question that Purdue went to towns that where doctors prescribe the most painkillers. That's where they went, because that's where you go to sell things if you have a better mousetrap. And that drug, and OxyContin as a medication is a good medication. Of course, it has to be prescribed properly and taken properly. But so they went there to sell to these small towns, mainly in Appalachia, and also in Maine and Northeast, because these are places that had the highest record of prescribing opioids, and mainly because there was lobstering and fishing up in Maine and logging, and those are very physically demanding. I mean, these guys have to half medicate themselves just to get out of the house in the morning. And in Appalachia, of course, there was the coal mining, although that was fading. But there's a long history of coal mining. And in addition to what Keith said, I think that set a real culture of liberal prescribing in these places for decades, because that's how you work. They make the economy run, these drugs, because men have to work. And so that whole general attitude of probably prescribing, having a low threshold to prescribe, is part of what got us to where we are, because doctors were so, again, used to prescribing a lot. But the other part is the diversion, and the diversion is huge. Why do you think all those pills, the billions of pills, were coming into West Virginia? That is a great book, Death and Mud. And they weren't all going to patients. Some of them were just being stolen off the truck. I mean, there was a lot of diversion. And even when it went to patients, I had tons of patients who would sell their drugs. I mean, these are folks who are financially scrambling, and when you can get a milligram, $1 for a milligram, and you may be getting an 80 milligram oxy or a 40, and you get a whole bottle. I mean, you can't blame people for doing that if they're struggling. So there was a lot of that going on. I mean, there was a whole, I say sort of jokingly, oxy economy. There was bartering with these drugs. I had patients when I was down there who never paid for anything in a restaurant. They just give the waitress a 40. And so it's much more complicated. I'll just say one more thing. I also think, and Keith and I may disagree on this, but I strongly think the addictive properties of these drugs have been overstated. And let me tell you what I mean. Like, if you're an alcoholic, alcohol's addictive properties are not overstated. But for me, I'm not. They're not overstated. So what I mean to say is, let me just go to the data instead. When you look at, and I think I've reviewed almost every paper because I'm writing a big thing on this, that the vast majority of people who are prescribed, this is definitely true in the acute medication situation, but to a large extent for chronic pain as well, the vast majority of people who are prescribed these drugs, especially in the acute setting, don't even finish them. Between 60 and 90% of people don't even finish the supply they're given. If this is so wildly addictive, how is that possible? How were there enough pills in medicine chests to have been stolen by your kid's, high school friend if these were so ravenously, universally addictive? They are ravenously and universally addictive for a subset of people, but not for most people. And
I want to see if we can pull a couple of these threads together,
Okay.
right? Because, okay, so we know that given the right setting, right environment, the right set of challenges, these drugs can do an enormous amount of damage. Tens of thousands of people dying from overdoses, really ravaging, entire regions of the country, not just communities, but regions. But as you're pointing out, Sally, it's like, I've never finished a bottle of oxycodone for any procedure
but
or
did
anything.
you sell it?
No, well,
We don't pay enough here.
I don't think I did. That's what the president said. I don't think so. So what is it? What is the connection between the drugs and the enabling social environment that's caused this problem? And this is really getting to what I think part of what Tony was asking was like, we now know these drugs are everywhere, people are ODing everywhere, but it's really, it hit these rural communities so hard. What was it? You've both worked at the community level. What is it about what's happening in these communities? You've talked about the symptom and the disease, Sally. You described the symptom, but what is the disease that we're dealing with that has made these communities so vulnerable to opioids?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's actually a good question to ask, why didn't you sell your pills, or why didn't you take them all? And I'm sure you've got reasons, and
It didn't feel good.
it didn't feel good. Yeah,
Yeah.
That's what. Yeah, I'm actually the same way. I don't finish them because I think they're awful. But I've treated people who said the first time I took heroin, it was like a hole in my heart that had been there my whole life filled up for the first time. There were more people like that, just liking that, and maybe for the reasons.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, like Sally is saying about how much daily misery is there. How much competition is there for other things you may do?
Not just physical.
No,
misery.
absolutely
Yeah.
not just physical. So if you look in rural areas and you ask people questions just like, how many friends do you have? People have way fewer friends than they used to. Do you go to church anymore? No, a lot of people don't go to church. Do you belong to a club? No, people don't belong to clubs anymore. There's physical pain, there's emotional pain. So that makes them more appealing, relatively. And all these choices are relative, right? We judge things, we say, how good is something? We're usually thinking, well, it's better than this or it's worse than that. But if you feel like your choices are all pretty bad ones, drugs become more attractive, despite their risks, than they would be otherwise. And so I always find it useful, like people ask me all the time, why do people use drugs? I say, would you ask me why people use sex? That's not a good question, right? They do it because it feels good. There is reward of some form right away. So the more interesting question to me is, why do so many people not use drugs who have access to them? Why do you and I have leftover opioids sitting in there? Because I think, well, I got a lot to lose, that's why. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to risk my health. I don't want to be separated from my family. But if I didn't have any of those things, why not?
But I want to push back on that a little bit, because that seems to imply then that there was a crisis in rural America, or a crisis even amongst people living in rural America in some way, that opioid was filling up. But you just cited a study that said, places that had triplicate prescriptions weren't as affected than others. States.
Yeah.
So, but Wisconsin, for example, as a state, was experiencing deindustrialization during that time, similar to West Virginia experiencing deindustrialization. So I worry that we do too much of a cause and effect. It might be the other way around, actually. That the oversupply created addiction, which then undermined actually the healthy things that were happening in that town.
Yeah. I don't think we have to make those kinds of choices. Addiction can, as Sally has said, can be sparked by misery, but it can certainly cause massive misery. Addiction wrecks families. It makes people lose jobs. It makes them more likely to be victimized by crime, more likely to have an accident, which then, of course, means they've got more physical pain, more emotional pain, that kind of thing. So that's sort of, I guess, a cat that chases its own tail forever and ever, which and the other.
Yeah, but there's also, as Freud would say, symptom choice. And if the opioids aren't around, and you are, leading a life that you can't tolerate, and you'll turn to something else. So you'd have to look at how much alcoholism was there in Wisconsin, how much depression was there in Wisconsin. It doesn't have to be the opioids; they just were there. And especially in Appalachia, they were normalized. There was a lot of pill abuse before OxyContin ever came along. And that's actually, Iyer quotes some great people. Another book, McGreal, you read his book, right? I can't remember the name of it though, but it was good. He's a journalist. And they've interviewed a million folks, doctors, even Art Van Zee, who arguably brought a lot of this to the attention of, he was in Southern Virginia, which is that many people were using these pills all the time. It's just that OxyContin was so potent that it took it to another level. One of the nurses this is in Sam Quinoz's book, referred to it as a pharmaceutical time bomb or atom bomb, just going off, so that people who already had an involvement with drugs, maybe at the abuse level, maybe even at the level of a mild addiction, just really tipped over. And so that's important too.
And I just want to pick up on just one part of that is that Ann Case and Angus Deaton's book, Death of Despair, which is very much worth reading, One of the things that people seem to have taken away from that is just the opioid part, but they're pointing out in these same regions huge increases in death in the same populations from alcohol, as well as suicides. And alcohol, the latest estimate, it kills about 175,000 people a year. How often do you hear about that in drug policy? All the illicits are about 100,000. So, it's just one of the things that's like right in front of our nose that we don't see, and we try to explain drug use and drug use consequences as if there isn't, this huge alcohol problem, as if it weren't a drug. So.
Well, it strikes me, and Brent mentioned some of our previous conversations, and we had conversations with the authors of the book that created an index of deep disadvantage, and looking at places in the U.S. where there was deep disadvantage, and they used indicators of health and life expectancy as part of that analysis. And it was rural places where the deepest disadvantage was, but it was also rural places where the highest advantage was. But those rural places had really strong social capital and economic connectedness. And it strikes me that what you're saying, there are two different things that I think we've heard through a lot of our conversations. One is that many rural places throughout history have been experience an extractive economy in some way. Interests coming in from the outside, looking to take the value that's in those places and take it with them. Like that's their market, and then they take it with them. And it strikes me that this is, in some respects, another example of that extraction.
In this case, the value being extracted was in Medicaid payments or insurance or whatever it was.
Right.
They're getting, this is the resource that's being pulled out of the community. It was also just sucking the life out of people in the process.
And then the second theme that we've heard a lot is that just kind of changes in our social constructs and our economy has put a lot of pressure on sort of community level institutions. So you mentioned churches, bank branches are leaving, local news is leaving, grocery stores are under pressure. So those things that when you think of those local institutions that kind of make your hometown, like that's what everybody depends on for kind of a healthy, thriving place, that those being under pressure and going away also takes a little bit of the underpinnings out for them to be susceptible to this kind of extraction as well.
And I agree with all that, and we haven't mentioned the biggest extraction, which is people, talented people. So I was in West Virginia, I had this very illuminating conversation with a friend of mine. He was saying people misunderstand why a lot of folks in West Virginia don't like universities. And they say it's not that they're scared of wokeness or radicalization of their kids. They have learned that if your kid goes to college, your kid moves away. And that's what they don't like. And that is what's happening all across the economy. And those people who are higher social capital, more resources, they might be the people who organized the group that people attended, or the ones who raised the alarm, or were a good journalist and all that. As they go, there's just more vulnerability left behind.
Yeah, in this town that I don't know if anyone's from Ohio or Southern Ohio, it's a little town called Ironton. And that was exactly, but it's like hollowed out places, with retirees and disabled people and addicted people. And then a layer of professionals. And they're usually people who have come from they're the lawyer family in town, or they have gone to school elsewhere and then come back, but certainly not enough come back. And so I agree that out-migration is really big problem. So you're selecting for a population that's going to find drugs more appealing, which is my other lesson, which is that, I think we pay too much attention to the power of the drug and not the vulnerability of the people using them.
Well, along those lines, and I'll just shift the conversation a little bit, but it'd be interesting to get your take on this. So we've been through a lot of litigation. There's been civil litigation, even criminal litigation. There's settlements now we've got, all told, something of the order of more than $50 billion worth of settlements. What's the highest and best use of that money? There's obviously been huge impacts on these communities that we've been talking about. That offers some opportunity to redress some of what's happened. How should we, well, from your perspective, how should we be thinking of the highest and best use of that money?
When I've been talking to state attorney generals and legislatures who allocate this, I emphasize it's not the amount of money, because it's paid out over a very long time, so it might only be 10 or 15% of your budget for the next 20 years. It's the freedom with which you can spend it. So you can spend this on pretty much anything. So you should do things for which there is no other funding stream. You don't need to hire doctors who could get paid anyway by insurance or Medicaid, but you might want to build a clinic. Where I would put a lot of it is in prevention. There's no epidemic in the history of the world that has ended by waiting for people to get ill and then trying to take care of them as best you can. We didn't bring HIV/AIDS under control by developing better treatments for late-stage Kaposi sarcoma. COVID was not brought under control by better ventilators and ICUs, right? They were preventative strategies. And we do not invest in that hardly at all. And when you say prevention, and I've had this experience very recently with a bunch of legislators, there's just eye rolls all around the table. People think you mean either a cop with a billy club threatening the kids about pot, or a charismatic person who's covered with jailhouse tattoos telling a moving story of their triumph over drugs. And that is 30, 40-year-old technology. Imagining that is what prevention is or can be is like saying, with a computer is the Tandy Radio Shack 80. Probably no one in this room actually gets that reference. The ENIAC.
I'm not sure I even get
Yeah, okay, good times back then, good times. A slide rule, I think people don't know what that is either. The abacus, there you go. There's great developmentally informed prevention. If you want to see it, you can go online, Communities That Care, where they invest in kids at age 10, 11, 12. Very little of it focuses on drugs, but it does focus on things like developing bonds with pro-social adults, with other kids, with school. It teaches them generic but very useful skills like recognizing and managing your emotion, coping with difficult circumstances. In big studies with thousands of children in them, when those investments are made, they are, over the course of their adolescence, about a third less likely to use drugs and to smoke and use alcohol. But also, 10 years later, they're 20% more likely to go to college. These are spectacular returns on investment, and not just for addiction, for everything. And we forget that, and we don't really have a funding stream for it. You can't, insurance, you can't build them, for prevention. So that's what I would be doing, number one, if I were a state. Say, let's put a lot of money into kids. Now, which may seem extravagant, like all these people are suffering and all that, and I know it, believe me, I've spent my whole career focusing on them. However, I don't want to be doing this 20 years from now. And the only way to get out of that is to go upstream.
Yes, I think the long game is where the real action is, but it's obvious I don't mean to be flip, but it's pretty obvious what you need to do acutely, which is, make sure your treatment program is working well and you're offering the medications that, work for opioids, which are, as you all know by now, I'm sure, methadone and buprenorphine. And there's another medication that's very good, but it's not that popular. It's called naltrexone. It is a good medication, but it's hard to get people to stay on it. Make sure everybody has Narcan. When I was visiting Ironton recently, I asked, my main question was, what changed in 5 years? Because I was there 5 years. That's when I did my year. And it was both encouraging and sad at the same time. It was how much better they got at keeping, how much better they got at giving out Narcan. So yes, you want that, of course, but the fact that they are having to do that is not good, and also how much more employers are the various accommodations that people in the community are making. So, I mean, that's good. You don't want them to be hostile to people who are suffering in this way. But in a way, it's unfortunate that they have to accommodate that way.
Well, let me ask, because Keith, you mentioned kind of the flexibility being a really important part. Is part of the conversation, and is it flexible enough that just you can invest in things like economic opportunity so that those 20% of the kids who are going to college actually see an opportunity to come back and we take care of that out-migration you were just talking about? I mean, I was working in philanthropy in North Carolina when the tobacco settlement went through. And North Carolina did something that I thought was really interesting and over time has proven really successful, where 50% of that settlement money, they set up an endowed foundation focused on economic opportunity in rural places called the Golden Leaf Foundation. I mean, should that be part of the toolbox here? Are we thinking, has the conversation been predominantly about kind of health interventions and psychological interventions?
Yeah, I'm not against making those investments. I think they're good investments to make. I don't think I would use the opioid settlement for it. You know, in part because there has to be some nexus, clear nexus between opioids and the money, which is hard. I think hard to establish with economic development, even though I support it. I mean, there are some unusual economic facts here. One is that this all started at a time of declining inequality in the United States, not rising equality, and it is not strictly true that if you look around the world, poverty causes addiction, because where you would see where is addiction the worst in the world, it's in rich countries, because you are buying something. It's not, you can be depressed for free, you can have schizophrenia for free, but you have to consume to have addiction. So even though I like that idea, it would help the state that I'm from, I'm not sure that you would be able to show at the end of it that you had reduced the rate of addiction.
I would, again, thinking of the small town Ironton, but there are millions of Irontons, I still think, yes, the economic aspects are fabulous, but you need folks who can give a clean drug screen to work in them, and that's one of the big problems. There was an industrial park they built, and they were having trouble hiring people, with pretty decent jobs, like at least starting at maybe $18 an hour, with real potential to move up. That may not sound that much, although it buys a lot in a small town, but still, it's certainly not as much as most people deserve. And so they couldn't find folks who could give a clean urine or even had adequate enough education. I remember one man saying to me, a factory manager, that he had trouble. People didn't even know how to use a ruler, not an abacus, not a slide rule, a ruler. And so if you put that, if you really build up the education as well as, as part of that long game, that I think that my sense is that a fair number of industries have these, like, for example, Intel is building this huge $28 billion factory outside of Columbus. And
Tony knows all about that.
oh, okay. Is it bad?
No, it's just the last podcast episode I did was on that.
Oh, was it? I'm gonna have to listen to it. Well, anyway, but if now Ironton is a big 2 hours away from there, but these big factories need all kinds of smaller support industries, and they could easily be located. And there is discussion of them being located, and some of them in southern Ohio. But who's going to work in them? Because they don't have enough engineers to work in them. That's not what they're interested in. A lot of it is robotics, but there's a decent middle ground for people who are motivated, drug-free, and educated enough to benefit from the training that they give you to really, to work there. And that, it will sound like Pollyanna, but that could really be a big thing.
And I think that's a good place for us to start wrapping up the conversation, which is, you can ask these questions. Well, is the opioid crisis a product of economics? Is it a product of collapsing communities? Is it a product of inadequate social connection? The answer is yes. It's all of those things.
Usually comes first, no?
Yeah. Well, I wonder.
different story.
I don't know.
Yes,
It could be that the economics comes first, but it's tough when you're talking about the issue that you just raised, which is a skills question.
Well, here we are
Like,
now.
right? Yeah. So we've got a few minutes for questions, and I just wanted to give couple people. Maybe we have time for 2 questions. So, oh my gosh. Okay, we'll start over here, and then you guys can duke it out. No, and we'll start over here. Oh, identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Dhruti. I'm a rising sophomore at Claremont McKenna. This question is for you, Dr. Satel. You mentioned that compelled treatment works. I was thinking about California's care courts that they recently instituted. It's for schizophrenia, but could fall under the category of substance abuse. Why does compelled treatment work, and what would you say to opponents of that this is a civil liberties violation?
Well, they committed a crime, so that's how you get into these places. It is different from the mentally ill, often from mentally ill folks. They get committed civilly, but if you go through the criminal justice system, I mean, people often have a choice. You can go to jail or you can be in this program. And when people take the program, I don't mean to imply it works in that everybody's fine afterwards. It's still not 100, by no means 100%, but as good as, sometimes not better than conventional treatment. Because well, the first thing is when you're in these programs, you usually, if someone makes you stand still, that's very important. You have to break the cycle of use, so that's incredibly important. And then, as I alluded to, I think earlier, very briefly, once a lot of folks are in these programs, you know, they're with people who are further along than them in the program, so they see that it's possible to start to get better. Their family starts to maybe reconnect with them a little more. They physically feel a lot better, and they, you know, do want to keep that going. And then they work with social workers and job rehab people who like make them think, Jesus, I could really have maybe a bit of a future here. So.
Okay, over here. Oh, over here. Go ahead. Sorry. You're good. You're on.
Am I on? Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, I'm on. Hi. Yeah, I had a very similar question actually, because I thought the point you made about how coercion tends to work really well was interesting. Like especially with involuntary civil commitments where there's no criminal charge. A lot of scholars from places like AEI or libertarian orgs push back at the fact that that's such a big liberties violation when no crime has been committed, and they kind of push back on the necessity for that coercion. I'm curious what different scholars at AEI and beyond feel about, you know, coercion works, but it's such a liberties violation without a crime. Interested in that?
Well, I would say that very few people are committed civilly for addiction, so they don't come in that door, right, Keith?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have I think you had a question too over here, and then we're going to walk it down. Right here.
Thank you. My name is Ben. I'm a rising senior at Princeton. I was wondering, with your conversation about kind of incentive structures and how people can respond to that, what kind of agency they have. In conversations about things like safe injection sites and needle exchanges, that's something, I'm a West Virginian, something we've talked a lot about as a kind of mitigative policy response. So I was wondering what you think about that. Is that something that's actually creating bad incentive structures that we don't want? Or is that something that may be necessary for mitigation, especially when people are, you know, using dirty needles, things like that?
Yeah, of course, needle exchange programs are about behavior change, right? We're trying to stop people from sharing needles. So in that sense, I would say it's a good thing. We're persuading them to do a healthier behavior, both for themselves and for everybody else in the community. On the supervised consumption sites, I'm less impressed with the data on those than a lot of the advocates are. I think it's a lot more ambiguous whether those do good or not. I don't think they do harm, but it is, you know, it's competing in a budget with things that actually have a lot more evidence of having substantial impacts on people's lives. So that's where I personally would, if I were managing a city or a county budget, I don't think I would be investing in those. I would be investing in treatment, recovery, overdose rescue.
Right, could we say that if anyone else has a question, they can send it to you and you'll
Yeah,
pass it on to us?
absolutely.
Is that okay?
You guys can email us or through Jeff and his team, and we'll get answers back. That goes for people online as well, if you've got any questions that haven't been answered yet. I want to thank you all for your attention, and in 15 minutes, I think your classes start, or some of you have classes starting. So
yeah, would you join me in thanking Brent and our panelists?
Thank you.